say you love me, but you won't come down. So I'm leaving tomorrow.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. It's time to talk with the man in white, Gerald Celente. Gerald, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Yes,
it's great
fantastic.
to see you, man. Yeah.
Gerald Celente, of course, you are the editor of trendsjournal.com, where you can find the quarterly Trends Journal for information about the most important trends shaping the future. And I guess the first question, Gerald, the stock market has been extremely volatile. The VIX, the volatility index, had its biggest surge ever, indicating fear and unrest. Are we in a 2008-like scenario? What happens from here? How would you make that comparison?
Why, I say it's a buying opportunity. That's what they're all saying on TV. No,
Yeah,
this
goodbye house, goodbye car.
Yeah.
There's a lot of goodbyes, yeah.
The reality is that there's a global meltdown. And the markets are just an indicator of, you have crashing commodity prices. You have plunging currency prices. This whole thing, as you well know, you've been talking about it for years, as we have, it was all propped up with fake money. There's no recovery, it was a cover-up. The volatility is real. Look, we've both been around a little while. Who's ever remembered a summer like this? This is summer.
The Son of Sam killings in the summer of, I believe, the 1980s comes to mind. It was very hot, and a lot of people were getting murdered, and there was a serial killer loose. Here we have a new serial killer. Her name is Janet Yellen. She's holding the global economy hostage, and she's pop, killing economies, creating Ponzi schemes. She's out of control. Who's going to save this? You got the white suit. You're the man on the white horse. Why can't you ride into town and say, you got a whole conference coming up in Kingston, which is a town you virtually own. It's called the Peace, Occupy Peace. Why can't you take over, Gerald? Please, we beg you.
So the reality is, as you well know, it's just, they have not raised interest rates, what, in 10 years, going on 10 years?
Yes.
And the big deal is, are they going to raise them in September? And if they do, it's going to go up, what, 25 basis points won't mean anything.
No.
So it keeps the Ponzi scheme going. But even at that, they can't keep the Ponzi scheme going because the global economy is collapsing. Because when you saw all of this money rushing in, it went to these emerging markets. And now the emerging markets are submerging. So you have Brazil, as you look back at the end of this week, look at their currencies, down to 37-year lows. They're back in a recession. Canada, it's not so far away. They're in recession. Look at the Aussie dollar. The Canadian dollar's now down to what? 2004 lows. The whole thing is collapsing. And the reality is that they talk about raising interest rates and what they call it, normalizing it, right? Normalizing interest rates, which by their own words means they've created a super abnormal condition. A bunch of abnormal freaks created an abnormal position in the marketplace, and now they're talking about normalization as though they're going to create it when they caused an abnormal situation.
There's no cure for global financial herpes.
None.
No. Now, you mentioned the emerging economies are getting a lot of attention. They were the beneficiaries of a huge influx of capital. They then have gone belly up. But there's a lot of flight capital now from China, Brazil, and these other countries that are leaving. And they're jacking up prices in New York and London in the real estate market. And so the policymakers and the talking heads on television will point to rising apartment prices in London and New York and say, aha, the economy is recovering, without indicating that the money that's forcing those prices to go up is escape or flight capital from the global economy that's crashing. So they're looking at one piece of the puzzle and drawing a conclusion that does not reflect the reality of the global economy. Is that a fair statement?
It's accurate because it's the same thing what they do with the equity markets. They use the equity markets as the gauge for a rising economy. So they're talking about that 0.1% with the dough that's fleeing these other countries where their currencies are collapsing and their commodities and their economies. I mean, look at the numbers coming out of China. You know, everybody's blaming China for this slowdown. China's only the canary in the global equity mine. Because if the United States and Europe aren't buying things, China's not making them. If China's not making them, all these resource-rich nations aren't selling natural resources to them.
Let me ask you a question about China, because they've taken an interesting approach to supporting their market. Instead of printing money, they're arresting journalists who say that the markets might be at risk of going down, and they are shooting or executing bankers. And it's a very different approach in the communist version of capitalism than in the capitalist version of capitalism we see in America. This idea of prosecuting journalists that suggests that markets are overvalued. I mean, going back a couple of years, Gerald Celente, I don't know if you remember the story, but there was one analyst on Wall Street who said Enron is overpriced. And the CEO of Enron, Jeff Skilling at the time, had that analyst fired. Shortly thereafter, Enron blew up and caused global consequences. They shoot the messenger. Here you have people in journalism in China that are pointing out the obvious, that the stock market is a bubble and it's popping, and they're arresting those people, they're prosecuting those people. It's a weird combination of communism meets capitalism. This could be the next cultural revolution. I think the new Mao is the central bank of China, and the consequences could be another 100 million people are wiped out.
It's not capitalism here either. It's fascism. It's the merger of state and corporate powers. Not only are they taking the prisoners for the journalists, if you sell short, we'll blow your brains out. You're not allowed to over in China. But look what happens in the States. The markets open up on a down note. We have Rule 48. What's Rule 1, number 1 to 47? How about letting the market do what it's supposed to do? Who's making this up? They're rigging the markets in front of us. Our guys are not supposed to lose.
Rule 48.
That's what they call it, Rule 48. You know what Rule 48 is. I think it's like the 11th commandment. I mean, it's right in there. Moses came down with it.
Well, I remember back in the crash of 1987, up until then, they had standard procedures for stopping trading in stocks. It was halt trading because there's an order imbalance. Then specialists on the floor would rebalance the book. They'd open up the stock at a price that would clear out the orders, and you'd resume trading. Then you had the crash of '87, and they introduced all kinds of new technology like trading collars and other types of ways to try to control that beast that they are feeding with all that cheap money and faulty accounting and stock buybacks. Now, in 2015, we're at the point where they're referencing something, Rule 48. They've enacted it dozens of times, several times in the past week. It's so arcane and so esoteric and so beyond the pale and so unrelated to anything that the point I'm making is that it really has become a merger, as you say, of state and corporations and bankers, and this is the new fascism, Gerald Celente. You've talked about it in your Trends Journal many times. We are facing a new form of fascism, which is defined as merger of corporation and state. But it is slightly different. It does have slightly different characteristics and a slightly different flavor. So can you just build on that a little bit more so people understand politically in the context of what's going on?
We're headed for a collapse that's going to be, we believe, as bad as the Great Depression, and it's much worse because there's combinations building on top of it. Look what's going on in Europe with the migrant situation. They're not migrants. These are people that are refugees from countries that have been bombed out by the United States and its coalition of the killing. Syria, Libya, Assad has to go, Gaddafi has to go. Who are these madmen to say that? Look what they've done. So now you have Libya, you have Syria, you have Afghanistan, Iraq, now Yemen, the United States and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, bombing the hell out of the poorest country there. So you have this escape coming into Europe. Now, pile on top of that a global slowdown of commodity prices. They're flooding out of Ghana, they're flooding out of Nigeria, Algeria. Go south of the border. Look what's going on in Brazil, look what's going on in Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, Bolivia. The people are leaving these countries as the economies are collapsing, as natural resource. Here, commodity prices right now, according to the Bloomberg Index, are back to 1999 levels. So now, pile on top of that civil unrest, wars developing, you have a situation of social and geopolitical unrest that the world has never seen. Just to put this into context, it took 100,000 years to 1900 to put 1.6 billion people on the planet. In 100 years, 5.2 billion added on. So now you have all of these declining countries, all of these countries destabilized. You have a problem that no one knows how to deal with, and it's going to get much worse as the economies decline and as wars increase.
Gerald, you mean 2 + 2 = 4? You mean to tell me that if we bomb countries for political reasons misunderstood or miscalculated or opportunistically, that the resulting flood of migrants is a direct result? Can we develop a metric that would suggest the number of migrants per drone? In other words, and bomb. So you have X number of bombs, X number of drones. You take that number and you figure out the migrants that are the result of each bomb. Can we develop an index like this over there at Trends Journal? It's called the Bomb Migrant Index of Global Population Movement. I mean, you drop a bomb, you get migrants. 2 + 2 = 4. If you bomb somebody's house and they've got no place to live and their economies are crashing because you've got occupying forces from central bankers around the world, they're going to migrate.
Not one piece of coverage in all of the major news around the world is blaming this on the United States, on France, and its coalition of the killing, with the UK, that have destabilized this whole area. All they're doing is calling it a migrant problem and how to address it, rather than looking at the cause. Because, as you well know, what is it? 6 companies control 90% of all of the media in the United States. So it's the prostitutes at large selling the lines coming out of Washington.
Right, and if you can, we can stay, maybe do another segment.
Oh, I'd love to.
Okay, and we're going to talk about negative interest rates and the phenomenon of negative interest rates. That's coming up shortly. And but before we jump ahead to look at these other issues, we still have you here for a bit. How does this 2015 period compare with 2008? How do you make that comparison?
Much worse, because of the bubble that's been created. At least in 2008, and that bubble was going up, it spread among the people. But now you see the wealth gap. It's the largest in the United States, worse than it was during the Gilded Age. And worldwide, what do you have, 85 people that are worth that have more money than 3.5 billion people? 400 people in the United States are worth, what, $2.25 trillion? So it's much worse because none of this has been spread out and everything's been going down. Here, the median household income in the United States has lost $6.5 thousand in general since 2007. It's down $6.5 thousand median household income.
Right, so that means that the entire theory of how to run this economy has completely failed, and the solution is to do more of it. Anyway, stay right there. We're going to do a second segment to follow up more on this. Gerald, we'll be back to you. Thank you for being on this episode.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time to return to the man in the white suit, Gerald Celente. Gerald, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me, Max.
Gerald, in the first half, we were talking about zombies. And there are many economic zombies. You know, the term, I think, first started being used to describe Japanese banks who had gone bankrupt essentially back in the early 90s, and they were being floated through what was the Japanese invention, quantitative easing, and other machinations of the central bank to try to keep alive something that should be allowed to die. And this has had repercussions going forward. Now everyone's doing it, but not only in the banking sector, Gerald. We see zombies in the fracking industry. It's an economically unviable sector, and yet it's kept alive through cheap money. And now we're seeing it, as we covered in the first half, Chinese cement companies. They are losing money on every pound of cement they sell, but they're being kept alive with more transfusions of cheap money. You've got zombie cement manufacturers. Where's this all going, Gerald Celente?
They have to try to cover their debt. Look, you talked about fracking. Look here in the States, the junk bonds, what is about 15 to 20% of them are in the energy industry?
Was that right? Up to 15 to 20% in the energy industry. Yeah. So to make the payments on those bonds in an industry that can't afford even to keep the lights on because the energy prices are not high enough to sustain the debt needed to do the fracking is absurd.
So what happens? They keep producing, more supply than demand, and they keep pushing the prices lower. So it's, again, these are desperate moves for desperate people, because you know that whole big fracking thing, every week there was a new story about another boomtown. So all of this investment money, when you go across the board on it, it poured in. And now you're seeing companies, number one, go bankrupt, and number two, more mergers and acquisitions, which means that at some point when this does solidify, you'll have a lot fewer companies owning a lot more. So more multinationals growing a lot bigger as the rest of them go out of business.
Right, I mean, one of the prime beneficiaries of this boom and bust cycle that seems to be engineered by bankers for bankers and their buddies would be like a Warren Buffett, for example, who's heralded as a brilliant business guy, but other than acquiring companies with cheap money, he's not really adding anything to the economy. As a matter of fact, he's taking a competitiveness away from the economy by removing the competitive landscape and creating an oligopoly, a vertically integrated monopoly. He's become a robber baron. I mean, is it fair to say that Warren Buffett is a new form, really a robber baron? Is there anything wrong with that statement?
Well, all of these hedge funds, private equity groups, and what they do. I mean, let's look at the reality again. And you know, you've been talking about it for years. All of this cheap money has boosted the stock markets. Well, they've tripled since 2009 in the States. Why? Because of stock buybacks, you're borrowing money for nothing. And mergers and acquisition activity. Merger and acquisition activity now is on record, on track to break all-time records. So of course, they're robber barons. It's no different, but the only difference is they had laws in place to stop the robber barons that have been deregulated from Clinton and Reagan and others. From Glass-Steagall to Robertson-Patman Act to Sherman Antitrust Act to Clayton Antitrust Act, one after another, they've been deregulated. So it's a new form of robber baron.
It's interesting because you're saying that the mergers and acquisitions activity is hitting record high. If you go back 20, 30 years, mergers and acquisitions, going back to the 1980s, the leveraged buyouts, were driven by corporations assuming control of other corporations because the assets on their books were valued cheaply, and you could use those as the basis for a loan to take over a company and then sell those assets. But it was based on discounted assets. But in today's environment, these mergers and acquisitions are based on discounted money.
That's it.
It's a completely different paradigm.
That's right.
And you can't, it's very destructive in that sense because the only way it continues is to keep money cheap, but keeping cheap money means commodities will continue to crash.
Commodities will continue to crash, and so too will the everyday people. Because once upon a time, when we were young guys, they used to have a thing called savings accounts. People actually used to put their money in a bank and get interest on it, and they actually retired on the stuff. Now you can't do that anymore, so it's only benefiting the major companies and the private equity groups that are borrowing money for free to buy back stocks and do deals.
All right, Gerald, you mentioned the savings account. For the millennials in the audience, a savings account is when you put money in the bank, and then the bank would pay you interest on your money at a level that was less than what they were charging people to borrow money from the bank. That used to be called the banking industry. You can look it up on Google. That's no longer with us. That's gone. There are no savings anymore. Not only are there no savings accounts, Gerald, not only are interest rates at zero, but now we're heading into negative interest rates. Negative interest rates. Can you give us a little background on what that means, negative interest rates, and how that plays out?
What it means is, particularly in Europe, you put money in the bank, you have to they charge you to keep it there.
Now, I was with a friend of mine last night, a very famous guy. I won't mention his name. I won't drop his name. I'm not that crass, but people will probably figure it out. It's the only famous guy I know. But I told him this, and he said, so what incentive do you have to put your money in the bank?
I got a better one for you. Look what they did with German bonds and Swiss bonds. I'll tell you what, you buy them at this price, and when you cash them in 10 years, I'll give you less for it because I like you. You're a nice guy.
Right, but what's the incentive to do that?
They think it's security.
Right, because the alternative is to keep them cash in your apartment, in your flat, in your house.
And that's why I'm bullish on gold.
Okay, but in other words, the banks are charging you to store your cash.
Exactly.
So if the bank's going to charge me 1% to store my fiat money, and a gold bullion service is going to charge me 1% to store my gold bullion, what insane person would choose to store paper at a 1% fee instead of storing gold at a 1% fee?
How about what sane person would buy a German or Swiss bond that's going to pay him less in 10 years than buy gold at this price and not think gold is going to be worth more? And when we're talking in 10 years, if you don't think it's going to be worth more, fine. I don't give investment advice. I'm just saying how I look at it. And let's look at we were talking about declining currencies. So now you're in Russia, you're in Brazil, you're in Mexico. Hey, the Mexican peso is at an all-time low. If you had gold rather than pesos, real, or ruble, wouldn't you rather have gold? Because gold is based on dollars, and your currency has declined so dramatically,
Well,
would you be ahead of the game?
Gold has hit new all-time highs against the Brazilian real.
Exactly.
It's doubled, tripled against the Russian ruble.
Exactly.
It's almost at new all-time highs against Japanese yen. It's not far off all-time highs in euros. It's all these other currencies around the world, it's either approaching or at or exceeded all-time highs, with the exception of the US dollar, which is the world reserve currency, the linchpin currency. All commodities are priced in dollars. Post-World War II supremacy of America, the basis of the American empire, the basis of the new Gerald Celente drone per immigrant index, which we're going to create on your site. It's collateralized by a dollar, that's collateralized by the Pentagon. A dollar is backed up by a bomb. It's not backed up by gold. It's backed up by violence. You're having a peace conference in Kingston, and the turnout has been, shall we say, not robust because there's no money in peace. There's no money in peace. The peace market's crashing. Gerald, how can you think about having a peace conference in an environment where the value of peace has never traded lower? Is that a contrarian bet?
No, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts did a wonderful piece on it. He said commentators are saying the peace movement is dead, and I'm reviving it. But this is an action
You're
plan.
the Warren Buffett of peace.
Yeah, look, I'd rather fight for peace than die for war. And they're taking us to war. Hey, this is an old story. Currency wars, trade wars, world war. Anybody forget World War II? What are they? Every day you pick up the paper, currency wars, trade wars. You can see where it's leading. The whole Middle East is destabilized. War talk everywhere. And that's why we're pushing for peace. And with peace comes prosperity. That's what people don't get. And but just let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing, this action plan. It's to close all the bases overseas, secure the homeland, put the troops to work rebuilding our rotted infrastructure rather than highways in Afghanistan, and force Congress to vote to go to war. Congress has not voted to go to war since World War II. And one little caveat, on each state ballot, a referendum, that we the people will tell Congress how to vote. Because we pay for the war with our money and our lives, and Congress doesn't represent us. They represent the people that give them, will be polite, campaign contributions, or as we used to say in the Bronx, bribes and payoffs. So that's what this is about. It's about ending this violence that's only draining us morally, spiritually, and economically,
Okay, but war,
and rebuild America.
Who said war is a racket? Smedley?
Butler.
Butler. Thank you. But now it's become war has become a Ponzi scheme. Like, for example, in the Iraq War, that story where they delivered $8 billion, I believe the figure was, in a chopper, landed in cash, directly minted into Washington, to hand out to keep things going. Like, they've got $8 billion in cash unaccounted for to just spill in Iraq, and yet somehow, magically, there's no money for infrastructure.
None.
There's no money for anything that supports peace. That's clearly, if you're giving $8 billion to warlords in Afghanistan, you're promoting war. Clearly, if you're spending $8 billion in the United States to build a bridge, you're promoting peace. So how do you're saying the peace market's undervalued, there should be a bull market in peace, there should be a bear market in war, but nobody in this economy is vested in peace. Nobody in this economy is outside the fact that their pension funds and their governments and their currency is vested in war. You said you had currency war, trade war, world war. We've seen the currency war. We've seen the trade war. Are we about to enter a world war?
Yes, where you hear it all the time. Look at the, it's every other day something about Putin. You look what's going on in the Middle East. It's out of control. It's out of control. After trillions, where did Stiglitz come up with the number? $7 trillion, $7 trillion for Afghanistan and Iraq war, and nothing other than more war. And look at the migration problem again, because of all the war. I have two friends of mine that are doctors in Syria. They had to move to Canada. That was a sophisticated economy, a very high level culture. It's gone because Assad has to go. Who are you to say Assad has to go? I have one of my 4 rules of peace. If you call him out, take him out. Yeah, you're gonna why he has to go? Go take him out. I got an idea. We can make a lot of dough. We'll take out the arena in Verona and put Obama and Assad in there. We'll put it on pay-per-view. See who wins. I mean, these guys, they all tough talk, but none of them are warriors. All they are commanders in chief.
Well, the peace conference sounds like it should be a must-go attend for anybody who wants to reverse the course of what looks like a world war coming. Tell us a little more details about the peace conference.
September 20th, at the most historic four corners in the United States where the seeds of democracy was sown, up in colonial Kingston. It's the only place where there are pre-Revolutionary War stone buildings on each corner. Kingston was the first capital of New York State. The Constitution that was written at the courthouse right across the street from us, 90% of that Constitution is America's Constitution. I mentioned George Washington, a real warrior, a guy that fought. No foreign entanglements, his farewell address. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, every one of them, no foreign entanglements. And that's what this is about. Bring home the troops, secure the homeland, rebuild America. The Rand Institute, they did a study.
Well, we've got to go.
Okay.
But Gerald Celente, the new George Washington of our times, you look the part. I'm ready to go in that direction. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank Stacey Herbert and our guest, Gerald Celente, who's involved in this epic program of peace. What's the website?
OccupyPeace.us.
OccupyPeace.us. Until next time, if you want to contact us on Twitter, use Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.